Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the live stream. I hope you're all very well this evening. Let's see who we have on tonight. We have Brother Benji, great to see you. We have Arl, great to have you on. Enzo the God, great to see you. Raven 1983 Witch, great to see you once again. We have Norflinger, great to see you. Killer, great to have you on moderating once again. Colin, great to see you. Adam, great to have you on. Adam, Alma, great to see you. Buxton, great to have you on once again. Tiny Demolition Lover, hope you're well up there in Scotland. We also have Chanty Rat, great to see you. Draconic, great to have you on. Maximinimus, great to see you. Mega Hairy Bum, great to have you on too. Jen, great to have you on. Mark, great to see you. Nick Young, great to have you on. Who else have we got? Ted Boy, great to have you on. The Freckle Pony, great to see you. Oraman, great to see you too. Tim, Fearless Wolf, great to have you on, both of you. Hattie, Young Ralph, Saddleworth, Angelo, Number Free, great to see you, Number Free, hope you're well. Roisin, great to see you. Pete Robbins, Inconsequential, George, and so many more. I want to say thanks to everyone for coming on. Hope you're all very well. Hope you had a nice weekend. And Valerio, thank you so much, Valerio. Hi, Max. Can Scotland really get independent? Well, that's an interesting question, and I'll definitely be covering it on the live stream tonight. Yes, I think a lot of the problems are political, not technical. But we're going to go into a bit of detail about that during the live stream. Of course, today, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon got the ball rolling. She delivered a speech in the Scottish Parliament about setting a date for next October, not next October, October 2023 for Scottish independence referendum. Of course, the response from the Labour Party and the Conservatives was, now is not the time. But when is the time? So, you know, they can jump up and down and complain about this is not the time, this is not the time. Well, the referendum will be over a year and a half away. So you can't say now is not the time, because it's not happening now. It's happening in a year and a half's time. So, you know, this argument, now is not the time, is a bit sort of ridiculous at this stage. And now it's never the time, it seems, because during, what was it, 2019, there was talk about a referendum, another referendum on Scottish independence, and the argument at the time was, no, now is not the time because there's this disaster of Brexit. It's dividing the country. Then in 2020, it was, well, there's COVID. You can't be having a referendum. You can't be talking about referendum during COVID. Then in 21, it was the recovery. Oh, don't be talking about referendum. We have to focus on the recovery. And then this year, there's a cost of living crisis. You shouldn't be talking about a referendum. You should be focusing on the cost of living crisis. So no matter what time you actually presented, the people who are against a second referendum. Now, this is always something that sort of annoys me, the idea that you can be against independence, but you don't have to be against a referendum, because a referendum is not a foregone conclusion. Referendum is the people will choose, and if they choose to remain in the union, or if they choose to become independent, that's up to the people. But having a referendum is not the same as becoming independent. And this whole idea, our first step is to try and stop a second referendum, is quite dishonest in a way. Because if you truly believe the union is strong and the Scottish people's place is in the union, then you should support a second referendum. You know, time has passed. And of course, the elephant in the room, Brexit, deeply influenced the last referendum. So you would imagine most people who are unionists would be supportive of a second referendum, but they're not. But we'll talk a bit more about that during the stream, of course. Thanks so much, Valerio. Hope you're well tonight. So I just wanted to start off. So something that happens with me many times is that I set up the stream, I choose some topics to talk about, things that are in the news at the moment. The day before I do the live stream, so if I'm doing it on a Tuesday, I prepare it on a Monday evening. On a Friday, I do the same thing on a Thursday. But, of course, this is some news that has dropped. A good friend of the show, Steve Bray. Well, we're just going to hear from Steve himself. This is extremely concerning. This is really worrying. The idea that a law has basically been written by Tory MPs to attack one guy. You know, they talked about noisy protests, but we all know what they're talking about here. This is a law that was created to deprive one man of his protest. You don't have to agree with Steve. You don't have to be on the same side, but you have to admit that this is his right to protest. And what's really annoying as well is the so-called advocates for free speech, be them in GB News or talk radio or online or other parts online. They have been completely silent. None of them have come up and said, yes, we support Steve and his right to protest. No, because it's not something they care about. They're only advocates for free speech when it's about free speech that they agree with. When it's free speech that they disagree with, they're completely silent. But let's hear what Steve had to say. And remember, Steve was on the Sunday brunch with myself and others a few weeks ago, maybe it's about over a month ago. A wonderful guy, really nice guy. And I spoke to him before and after the stream. And a really down-to-earth, simple, in sense, you know, ordinary guy, simple person, not, you know, there's no arrogance or anything about him. And he's trying to, and he's been doing it for years now, he's trying to do the job of Parliament. That's the way I see it. Because Parliament can't hold the Tories to account. They can't hold Boris Johnson to account. They can't hold these corrupt Tories to account. So somebody has to do it. Somebody has to call out their lies and their corruption. And Steve has been doing that.
Wherever I went, I had a team of officers following me.
How many?
8 at one point, and then towards the end of the day, it was down to 2.
What do you think of that use of police time, Steve?
Well, look, it's a waste of money. It's the kind of thing they do in North Korea and Russia, the old Soviet Union. We're heading down a very dangerous path, and I think whatever people protest, you know, we don't have to agree with each other, but what we can agree on, we have a basic human right, which is the right to protest. Once you start taking that away, we're heading down a very slippery slope.
They're not taking away your right to protest. That's my understanding anyway. It's just, you're just apparently a bit too noisy.
They're not allowing him to protest outside Parliament. So they'd prefer to say, yeah, you can protest in a field somewhere where no one can hear you. That's not protesting.
Protest is all about sound and vision. If they want us to stand there with our arms folded, nobody will know anything. You know, this is dissent. Government needs to be held to account. And that's what we do in our own way.
So they've got your amplifiers. So until you get them back, or until someone donates you some new equipment, I mean, would you, if you got some new amplifiers, would you do it again?
Look, I can't possibly say what I'm bringing tomorrow.
Wonderful, Steve. Of course, you know, he has to be careful what he says because he could end up in jail.
But let's just say it's not going to be quiet.
Well said. Well done. Just a bit more on that. It says here, stop Brexit man's police swoop on Steve Bray and seize sound equipment. Met officers move against activists on same day that controversial new protest laws come into force. There, you know, the protest law came into force. The anti-protest law came into force. And what did they do? They swooped down on Steve. And, you know, this is a law created for one. And what about, for a moment, all these police officers? Shouldn't they be out, you know, dealing with real crimes? This is not a crime. A noisy protest. This is, you know, there are people getting mugged in the streets of London. There are people getting their wallets and bags stolen. There are people getting assaulted. There are people getting abused on the street, racially abused, sexually abused on the street as well. And why aren't the police doing anything about that? No. They want to focus on this guy who has a noisy protest. Where is Toby Young's free speech union in support of Steve Bray? These right-wingers are conscious by their absence. Yes, and I think it was Toby Young. I tagged Toby Young on Twitter about this, and I haven't heard a response. Because they support free speech that's on their side. They don't support free speech that's against their politics. It's easy to fight for things you agree with, but it's difficult to fight for things that you disagree with. And Steve talked about this as well. You don't have to agree with me, but everyone should have the right to protest. The activist known as the Stop Brexit man faces prosecution after police officers attempted to shut down his regular protest near Parliament, seized his equipment as controversial new protest laws came into force. Steve Bray, a former coin dealer and unsuccessful Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate, posted videos on Twitter showing officers approaching him near Parliament Square on Tuesday. His sound system was seized. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which came into force on Tuesday, the exact day that it came into force, the police were, the police could have easily just ignored this and said, look, we'll deal with it later. No, on the very day that the law came into force, they were down there immediately. Introduce an offence of intentionally or recklessly causing public nuisance and an attempt to crack down on disruptive guerrilla protests of the kind used by climate change activists. And today it's Steve. Tomorrow it will be people protesting against protesting for climate action. You don't like Priti Patel, and you're protesting against her removing people to Rwanda. You'll get arrested for that as well. The Minister of Justice said the police would be supported with the new powers to tackle non-violent protests and have a significant disruptive effect on the public or access to Parliament. Look, Steve, this is what Steve basically does. I'll show you here. This is him on the 24th of May, speaking to Andrea Leadsom, Tory MP.
Hello, Andrea. Do you think Boris lied to the House, Andrea? What do you think?
Are you still there, Steve?
I am. Do you think Boris lied to the House, Andrea?
I think you're very boring, Steve.
Well, I think you're very deadly for the country.
That requires him being removed from the streets, his sound equipment being taken away. Johan, thanks so much for that super chat for the funder of a new amplifier. Yes, that's what I want to do. I want to give some money to Steve to help him get a new amplifier. So we'll definitely do that. Thanks so much for that super chat. I'll get on to him. Maybe we can get something going, actually. Tories would send all political dissenters to the gulag and call it patriotism. Did Bas Javid send them? Bas Javid, of course, being Sajid Javid's brother, and who's head of the Met, is it? Or he's a senior police officer anyway. But back to this article. Thanks so much for that super chat, Magic. The Metropolitan Police said Bray's equipment had been seized under Section 145 of the 2011 Police Reform Social Responsibility Act, which gives the power to seize items being used for prohibited activities in Parliament Square. That includes operating amplified sound equipment in the controlled area. The Met said his offence had also been reported, meaning it would be considered for prosecution. Who was it reported by? Obviously Tory MPs. Bray posted videos of himself setting up a protest on Tuesday morning, acknowledging that he was doing so despite police warnings. He tweeted, "The police are harassing the hell out of this protest today." Young Pang, policy and campaigns officer at Liberty, said, "Protest is not a gift from the state, it's a fundamental right. Being able to choose what, how and when we protest is a vital part of a healthy, functioning democracy, and nowhere is it more important than at sites of power like Parliament, especially at a time when the government is bringing in laws that make it harder to challenge them." I've said this before. The Labour Party can't hold Boris Johnson and the Tories to account. Parliament can't hold Boris Johnson and the Tories to account. Boris Johnson's own party can't hold him to account. Then what is there left? Honestly, Boris Johnson can call an election on a whim, as his, at his please. He can decide, okay, the polls are favourable at the moment, I'll call an election. That's unacceptable. He has the media on his side. He has both mainstream and the Rupert backing media on his side. And the first past the post system allows Johnson and the Tories to win a majority of the seats without winning a majority of the votes. So what is there left? People have to protest. Number 3, thanks so much for that super chat. I posted with I protested with a megaphone in Liverpool today. No police around. I spoke to one on my way back to the car. He didn't even know about the new law. Thanks so much, number 3. I think there's a real attempt in Parliamentary Square and around Westminster to shut down any type of protest. Thanks for that super chat once again. It goes on to say, a Met Police spokesperson said, a protester in Whitehall has had his amplifier equipment seized by Met Police officers at around 1300 hours on Tuesday, the 28th of June. The man was using the equipment in a zone where the use of amplified equipment is prohibited. He was spoken to by officers on multiple occasions in relation to the specific legislation regarding the use of the amplifying equipment and that it would be seized if he persisted. The individual continued to use the amplified equipment and it was seized. Wouldn't they be better off doing real work, dealing with real crime? But this, as Steve said, is a slippery slope. Today it's Steve Bray. Tomorrow it's environmentalist protesters. The next day is people protesting for their own rights. And then after that, you'd be forced out onto the street to praise the dear leader or something like that. So I'm going to keep an eye on this story. Full solidarity with Steve. And I'm hoping to speak with Steve. Maybe I'll try and contact him directly and see how things are going, and I'll keep you guys updated. I want to move on to, of course, the other big story today was Scottish independence. Let me bring up the link. Just a moment.
Presiding Officer, it is axiomatic that a referendum must be lawful. But my deliberations in recent times have led me to this further conclusion. The lawfulness or otherwise of the referendum must be established as a matter of fact, not just opinion. Otherwise, as we have seen again in recent days, opposition parties will just keep casting doubt on the legitimacy of the process so that they can avoid the substantive debate on independence which Scotland deserves, but they so clearly fear.
And that's true. This attempt, and I've said it before, this attempt to stop the referendum taking place, it's a two-step process. So first, the likes of the Labour Party and the Conservatives in Scotland, and Boris Johnson's government as well, will try to, okay, what we'll do is we'll stop the referendum. We'll try and throw as many obstacles in place of the referendum taking place. And then once it has jumped over that hurdle, once it's passed that hurdle, then what we'll do is then we'll campaign for the union. So they're not going to campaign for the union now. What they're campaigning is at the moment is against a second referendum. It is quite absurd. You know, if you believe the union was strong, you would support a second referendum, but they don't, so they won't. So their first port of call is to try and stop a second referendum. And they're going to use whatever... And this is what's going to happen, guys. Over the next year and a half, you're going to see all the dirtiest tricks in the book being pulled out. You're going to see politicians you haven't heard of in decades being pulled out, being put on TV, travelling around Scotland, trying to convince the public that a second referendum is a bad idea at the moment. And they're going to throw as much political capital at that endeavour and hope that it succeeds. You know, now is not the time. There's a cost of living crisis. And I've seen it already how the ire has been directed at Nicola Sturgeon herself and the SNP. But once again, and I've said this before, and people need not to be distracted by this, a referendum, Scottish independence is not, how can I put this? The value of Scottish independence is not based on the electoral record or governmental record of the SNP. The SNP is not Scottish independence, basically. Okay, they are campaigning for Scottish independence. Now, the SNP will make arguments for Scottish independence, but people have to look at it as, yes, we would like to have an SNP government, for example, in an independent Scotland. But the way the SNP runs Scotland at the moment is not the same as what Scotland would look like as independent. So it needs to be viewed in that way. And what the likes of the Labour Party and the Conservatives are trying to do is they're saying, look at what a disaster the SNP have inflicted upon Scotland over the last over 10 years that they have been in power. But this is not an argument against Scottish independence. If you want, this could be, if it's true, and I think it's a lot more complicated than simply they're doing a bad job. There are a number of things, you know, maybe in some ways there are problems with how they're operating. In other ways, they're limited in what they can do because they're a devolved power. Scotland has devolved powers. It doesn't have full independence. So attacking them as being, the Scottish government is not working correctly. It's not doing its job. Yes, but in some ways it can't because it doesn't have all its powers. If it was independent, it would. So you're going to see a lot of rhetoric pointed at the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon as arguments against independence. And that's a pile of crap because the Scottish government at the moment is not an independent government. It doesn't have access to all the levers of power. Now, if you want to make arguments against independence, you can do that, but you can't use the SNP as an example or the SNP government as an example.
That is not in the country's best interests. Let me turn then to the detail of the steps we will now take to secure that objective of an indisputably lawful referendum, and then ensure that from today we can focus on the substance of why Scotland should be independent. Presiding Officer, I can announce, first of all, that the Scottish Government is today publishing the Scottish Independence Referendum Bill. I will draw attention in particular to three key provisions of this bill. Firstly, the purpose of the referendum, as set out in Section 1, is to ascertain the views of the people of Scotland on whether or not Scotland should be an independent country.
I just want to respond to some comments I'm seeing in the chat. I know some people may prefer me just to let this run through, but I think it's important to respond to some things. So Mark Humphrey says, Tories don't want Scotland doing better in the EU. Yes, and we can see a perfect example of that in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has the Northern Ireland Protocol, which allows it to have access to the UK internal market and the European single market. Now, Scotland would probably have something different, but yes, the Tories don't want places doing well with their own type of Brexit. They would prefer Scotland to remain as part of the UK. And I think that's a valid reason as well, because if Scotland was able to rejoin the European Union, or join the European Union, whichever way you want to put it, it would do well in that aspect. Of course, there would be problems, but it would do well in respect to that. And that would be embarrassing for Brexiteers. Because Brexiteers want everyone to suffer, it seems.
In common with the 2014 referendum, indeed in common with the Brexit referendum and the referendum to establish this Parliament, the independence referendum proposed in the bill will be consultative, not self-executing, just as in 2014 and recognised explicitly in the 2013 White Paper. A majority yes vote in this referendum will not in and of itself make Scotland independent. For Scotland to become independent following a yes vote, legislation would have to be passed by the UK and Scottish Parliaments.
Why is it when it came to Brexit this was never mentioned? Or it was very rarely mentioned. But Nicola Sturgeon is pointing this out at the beginning. A yes vote does not automatically mean that Scotland would become independent. It will have to be passed by Parliament. So I think that's being honest.
Now, there has been much commentary in recent days to the effect that a consultative referendum would not have the same status as the vote in 2014. That is simply wrong, factually and legally. Let me be clear. The status of the referendum proposed in this bill is exactly the same as the referendums of 1997, 2014 and 2016. The next provision of the bill I wish to draw attention to relates to the question to be asked in the referendum. The bill states that the question on the ballot paper should be, just as it was in 2014, should Scotland be an independent country?
I think that's very important. So it's not ambiguous. It's not what, some people may want, can you imagine if it was the Tories? Do you think a weak, fragile Scotland should become detached from the rest of the UK? Something like that. It'd be a deeply loaded question. Should Scotland become an independent country? Yes or no?
Finally, Presiding Officer, the bill includes the proposed date on which the referendum should be held. In line with the Government's clear mandate, this is a date within the first half of this term of Parliament. Presiding Officer, I can announce that the Scottish Government is proposing that the independence referendum be held on the 19th of October 2023.
So, gives us, a year and a half, more or less, of campaigning. And, as I said before, what the opposition parties in the Scottish Parliament will try and do, and Boris Johnson's government will try to do, is throw as many obstacles in its way. You're going to hear from the leaders of the two opposition parties in a moment, but this, I think what she's doing here is giving it lots of time. So, they can't come back and say, we should be focusing on the cost of living crisis. Yes, but you can focus on the cost of living crisis. The campaigning has not begun yet, and the campaigning will probably not begin for a while. I imagine the SNP, the government is not going to do a lot of campaigning, but the SNP itself will do campaigning, and other independence movements within Scotland will do a lot of campaigning. And I imagine the pro-union campaigns should, if they're worth their salt, they would start campaigning as well. So they would campaign for the union and not be wasting time, which I think would be the case, wasting time trying to stop the referendum, because I don't think at the end of the day it's going to be stopped. It's going to go ahead. A lot of obstacles are going to be thrown in its course, in its way, but it will go ahead. And it's now a case of, do you campaign to try and stop it and waste time, or do you campaign for the union?
These are...
Thank you. Thank you. Members.
These are the key elements of the referendum legislation that the Scottish Government wishes this Parliament to scrutinise and pass. Let me turn now to the aim of establishing as fact the lawfulness of a referendum, which, as I have already indicated, I consider to be of the utmost importance. I will start with what we know already. We know that the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament to pass this bill in the absence of a Section 30 order is contested. We know that legislative competence can only be determined judicially. And we know that for as long as there is no judicial determination, opinions will differ and doubt will continue to be cast on the lawful basis for the referendum. That benefits only those parties opposed to independence, because it allows them to avoid the substance of the independence debate. Finally, we know that if this Parliament does seek to legislate without a Section 30 order, the bill will go to court. That is inevitable. The only questions are when it ends up in court and at whose hand. If the issue of legislative competence remains unresolved at the point of formal introduction of a bill, the UK Government will almost certainly use Section 33 of the Scotland Act to refer it to the Supreme Court after it has passed. It is
Now, I don't know all of this. I'm not an expert. I should speak to some experts, and I'll try and get on some experts, try and speak to some experts who some of you may know. But if this goes to the Supreme Court, I would imagine if the Supreme Court says no, then it would actually work in Nicola Sturgeon's favour, because she would say, well, look, the UK Supreme Court doesn't believe that we should have a referendum. Why should they tell us what to do? But on the other hand, if they say, yes, you can go ahead with it, then full steam ahead. So, you know, there's also the possibility that if the UK Supreme Court says sides with the UK government, it could drive a wedge between, a deeper wedge between Holyrood and Westminster, and it would serve the independence movement's goals, because it would demonstrate, look, Westminster doesn't care about us. Westminster doesn't want us to leave, in a sense.
It's also possible that one or more private individuals will lodge a judicial review of the bill. Indeed, it was reported last week that Tory supporters are already planning to do so. A challenge by private individuals could also go through successive courts and so be a very lengthy process. Either way, at the point of Parliament passing the bill, there would be no certainty about when or even if it could be implemented. A court challenge would still lie ahead, and the timetable I have set out today would quickly become difficult to deliver. And of course, between now and then, claim and counterclaim, good faith arguments and bad faith fear-mongering about so-called wildcat referendums will continue to muddy the water, cast up doubt and taint the process. Presiding Officer, that may well suit politicians opposed to independence, but none of it would be in the interest of the country, and none of it would serve democracy. The fact is, neither legal opinions nor political arguments will resolve this point. We must establish legal fact. That is why, in my view, we must seek now to accelerate to the point when we have legal clarity, legal fact. And crucially, in doing so, I hope, establish and safeguard the ability of this Parliament to deliver a referendum on the date proposed. Presiding Officer, it is to this end that some weeks ago I asked the Lord Advocate to consider exercising the power she has under paragraph 34 of Schedule 6 to the Scotland Act to refer to the Supreme Court the question of whether the provisions in this bill relate to reserved matters. This is a power exercisable by the Lord Advocate alone, not by Scottish ministers collectively. Whether or not she does so is accordingly a matter solely for her. However, I can confirm that the Lord Advocate has considered this request. She has taken into account the following factors: this government's democratic mandate, the constitutional significance of this issue, the fact that the bill does raise a genuine issue of law that is unresolved, and the importance of ensuring that this government and Parliament act lawfully at all times. And she has now informed me of her decision. I can advise Parliament that the Lord Advocate has agreed to make a reference of the provisions in the bill to the Supreme Court. Indeed, Presiding Officer, as I speak, the process for serving the requisite paperwork on the UK Government by lawyers and messengers at arms is underway, and I can confirm that the reference will be filed with the Supreme Court this afternoon.
So the ball is really rolling. I'd like to speak with some people about this to fully understand the ins and outs, because it is quite complicated, especially from a legal point of view. But I think what she's doing here is she's setting a flag, putting down a flag. This is where we're hoping to get to. People will try and stop us from getting to this point, but the fact that there's a date that has been set, and it's far out enough that it can't be used as a, well, you need to be focusing on the problems of today. It's far out enough. And then I think it's also gives the Scottish Government enough time to iron out any legal issues, if there are any. You're going to hear a lot of back and forth over the next number of months. But we're not even talking about whether Scotland, the people of Scotland, will vote yes to become independent or not. We're just talking about the legal issues that will lead up to that. Now, of course, there has been a response from the two main parties, the two main opposition parties in Scotland. First, this was from the leader of the Labour Party.
It's important to establish the legal basis of a referendum, but it's also important to consider the timing, the context and the effect. And I think the First Minister gave the game away in the latter part of her statement. This is actually all about the general election and the SNP having some relevance in it than actually about the Scottish people. But it's important to recognise the context of the election campaign last year. We were still a country living under COVID restrictions. Over 10,000 of our fellow citizens had lost their lives. Nicola Sturgeon said during that campaign that people who didn't support a referendum or independence through the recovery should vote for her, safe in the knowledge that COVID recovery would be her priority.
But the recovery has already taken place, has it not? Or it's ongoing at the moment?
COVID hasn't gone away, and our recovery hasn't even started. Since that election, and when Nicola Sturgeon gave that pledge, 4,000 more Scots have lost their lives. 43.
But we're talking about other issues as well. Like, why are we talking about Ukraine? Why are we talking about Brexit? Why are we talking about Northern Ireland? Why are we talking about a whole number of issues? If this is something, obviously he's being disingenuous here. He's trying to say that, well, we should be focusing on these two issues that I have highlighted and not independence. But we should be also focusing on Ukraine. We should be focusing on refugees coming from Ukraine. We should be focusing on climate change. We should be focusing on many issues, but not independence. So we should be focusing on 10 different issues, including the cost of living crisis, but not independence. Okay.
In the last week have died due to COVID. There are over 700,000 Scots on NHS waiting lists. Over 10,000 children and young people waiting for a mental health appointment. Almost 20,000 fewer businesses in Scotland today than when the pandemic began. And this week the ONS warned that inflation could reach 11%, meaning higher bills and deepening the cost of living crisis. For households across the country, it doesn't feel like the crisis is over. Isn't it the case that the pandemic, Nicola?
Her argument would be, we can deal with these crises better if we're independent, because we'll have access to the full levers of power. At the moment, we can't access all powers because a lot of them are reserved. So there are devolved powers that Westminster has given over to the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, and there are powers that are retained in Westminster. And, for example, raising income tax. So the Scottish government may wish to say, well, you know, to deal with the cost of living crisis, we should raise income tax on maybe higher earners, but we can't do that because that's a reserved power. We can raise some taxes, but we can't raise all taxes. If we were independent, we could raise all taxes, but we can't do that now. So that would be that would be an argument for independence. The idea that you would be able to raise whatever taxes you want, but because Scotland is a devolved administration, it can't do that. Now, we also heard from the other unionist leader, Douglas Ross. Let me bring him up here. Here he goes.
Sturgeon, because Nicola Sturgeon is at it all over again. Yeah. Her eye is off the ball once more. The real priorities of people across Scotland are on the back burner. Instead, the First Minister is putting her plans to divide Scotland front and centre. Nicola Sturgeon has shown again today that the SNP's selfish obsession with another divisive referendum is always their top priority. She will use government time and resources to further her plan to break up the country just when we need to be pulling together and working as one.
I understand that Douglas Ross did not support Brexit, but let's imagine we're not talking about Scottish independence here, we're talking about Brexit. You could apply this rhetoric to Boris Johnson's government. Why isn't Boris Johnson reaching out to the people? Why isn't he trying to bring the country together back in 2019? Not dividing the country. The judiciary were called enemies of the people. Ramoners. People who are trying to stop Brexit. Things like this. This was not bringing the country together. His party was not bringing the country together. So you can't use this sort of rhetoric against the SNP here.
All of our focus should be on tackling these huge challenges we face right now, helping families with their bills, supporting frontline services and creating good jobs.
Once again, these are all arguments that you could be used. Well, so should Scotland have more powers? Would Douglas Ross support the Scottish Parliament receiving more powers, access to more cash, being able to raise more finance? Well, his party wouldn't, because if you look at any Tory MP, pretty much any Tory MP in England, they voted against allowing the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly access to more powers. The Tories are against devolution. So of course they're against independence, but they're even against devolution. They want the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Ireland Assembly to have fewer powers. Well, Northern Ireland is a special case, but the Scottish and Welsh devolved governments, they want them to be much weaker than they are today. It's about controlling them. If you don't believe me, look at any Tory MP's voting record and you'll see they voted against extending powers to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Northern Ireland is a different case though. Genocide Jim, great to see you on the stream. She pulled the rug from them today. You could hear the gasps. The pundits and social media got it wrong. She will lead us to independent. Thanks so much for that super chat, Genocide Jim. I think this idea that she's placed this flag, as I said before, she's put down the flag and the Scottish people can see, okay, this is probably when it's going to take place. And any attempt to, I think it was a very shrewd approach, because anyone who tries to stop the referendum taking place will be seen as somebody who's trying to stop the Scottish people from having their vote on the 19th of October. And it won't go down well for anyone. They will be seen as trying to stop democracy. And it won't be viewed in a good light, even if you're pro-union, because you'd say, well, we should actually have a referendum and we should be given the chance to vote. This is you can see it's very difficult, not so much for the Tories because they don't give a crap about Scotland, but for the Labour Party, who would like to, the Labour Party were the biggest party at one stage in Scotland. And they, again, would like to have a significant amount of power. But they have to be careful what they say. They have to be saying, yes, we support the Scottish people's right to choose, but now is not the time.
A potentially illegal referendum next year is the wrong priority for Scotland.
Potentially illegal. But potentially illegal. Okay, not illegal, potentially illegal. Okay, and that's enough from Douglas Ross, who's not very popular within his own party in Westminster at the moment. So guys, before we move on to the next topic, of course, we'll have a little break and we'll get back to the serious stuff back in a moment. I hope you enjoy this funny video and we'll talk a bit more about these topics. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Nadine Dorries, the Cabinet of Culture, and today I tweeted this good tweet. This Gov will remain relentlessly focused and continue to deliver for people during a post-pandemic mid-war global cost of living challenge which no Prime Minister or Gov has faced the likes of since World War XI. People have suggested there is no such thing as World War XI. Well, that is just typical wokery-pokery, and actually there is 11 World Wars actually, and here they are. Listen and learn, it's culture time. World War I, the Great War, and it really was great. World War II, the main one that we all love. The one with Hitler and Spitfires and all that lovely rationing, as well as the Blitz, which was, something to do with silk stockings. The famous war, Churchill's War. Churchill is a dog and a statue. World War III. This was Vietnam, which was a movie war, and a damn good one. World War IV, the war that rhymes, which took place at Woodstock, and Hendrix played, I think, and I should know because I am the Culture Secretary. World War V, the Cold War, so called because it happened in the winter. Brr. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that war! And the war was over because summer arrived. World War VI, this happened in the Falklands, which is a town in Argentina. I believe it was musically dramatised in the film West Side Story. No, that was something else. World War VII, that was West Side Story. World War VIII, oh, this one was a lot of fun. So basically, Sharon is married to Grant, but she starts having an affair with his brother Phil, and then Grant finds out, and well, I'll tell you something, it's like a modern-day Tristan and Isolde. They were from Corrie, by the way. Just things I know as the Minister for Cultures. World War IX, Margaret Thatcher versus treachery with a smile on its face. Yes, that's right, she fought against her party and her country for women everywhere, and that's why she's now known as the Queen of Hearts. World War X, Blur versus Oasis, and I actually prefer Cooler Shaker. World War XI, Ross and Rachel. Was it a break or not? I don't know, but it was a war. It was the 11th World War. And now we fight on with a Prime Minister who is loved by everybody except for jealous little snakes in the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, who today took 2 seats away in 2 by-elections. Well, I hope it makes them very happy. Good God, Labour and Liberal Democrats, what a sad little life.
Oh my goodness. So just sticking, of course, with Scottish independence and the referendum for a moment. It says here, Nicola Sturgeon has asked the Supreme Court to rule on whether the Scottish Government can hold a non-binding referendum on independence without having Boris Johnson's permission to stage one. Some other news, it says here, Boris Johnson has sought to diffuse anger over number 10 briefing that would ditch a manifesto commitment on defence spending but face criticism from Labour for breaking a pledge made even more crucial by the Ukraine war. No, but I wanted to... yes, here it is. Number 10 says it wants to see the Supreme Court decide what the Supreme Court decides in relation to Holyrood referendum bill. So in response to Nicola Sturgeon's announcement, Downing Street has said that Boris Johnson remains opposed to a second independence referendum now, but it will wait and see what the Supreme Court decides about the legality of the Scottish Government's bill. A spokesperson for Number 10 said, "Our position remains unchanged that both ours and the Scottish Government's priorities should be working together with a relentless focus on the issues that really matter to people." Notice the condescending tone here that really matter, as if independence doesn't really matter to Scottish people. You know, if independence didn't really matter to Scottish people, then they wouldn't have returned the SNP and the Greens with a majority. If they didn't care about independence, they would have voted for the Liberal Democrats or the Tories or the Labour Party in Scotland, but they didn't do that. But a decision has been taken by the First Minister, so we will carefully study the detail of the proposal, and the Supreme Court will now consider whether to accept the Scottish Government's Lord Advocate's referral. The Lord Advocate is the Attorney General in Scotland. Let's see if there's anything else about that. Yeah, so it seems what's going to happen. Here we have what could happen. So on referring the referendum bill to the Supreme Court, so on what happens if the Scottish Government wins. So obviously, if this government hopes that the question in this bill proposing a referendum is consultative, not self-executing, and I think this is part of the idea that if the Scottish Government say that this is a consultative referendum, then the Supreme Court will probably reply and say, okay, yeah, you can go ahead with that. Then it puts Boris Johnson's government in a difficult spot, because the Supreme Court would say, yeah, that's okay. Johan, would Labour really lose votes in the Parliament when when the SNP took those votes? Let me read thanks so much for that super chat, Johan. Would Labour really lose votes in the Parliament when Scotland took those votes? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Thanks, Katrina Bryce. Lord Advocate is like the Lord Chancellor. Solicitor General is the Attorney General. Sorry about that. Thanks for the correction. I'm not sure I understand what you mean in your super chat, Johan. Would Labour really lose votes in the Parliament when SNP took those votes? No, I need to clarify it. Apologies. I'll just see if you can hear him. Okay. But if it's at the moment, there's more and more support for the SNP. So the support for the Labour Party and the Tories is going down. Now, what could happen is that if there's an election, if Boris Johnson, for example, says, okay, we're going to call an election before the independence vote, that would mean that the SNP would run on the issue of independence and say, you have to vote for us, otherwise we're not going to be able to get an independence vote, a second referendum, sorry. But I think that it would not help the SNP's opponents, those being the Liberal Democrats, Tories, and the Labour Party, because what would they be offering? Not a Scooby-Doo what he's meaning. Apologies for that, Johan. I'm not sure I understand your question. The reason why Labour have not won a majority in so long is because they have lost Scotland. What good does the SNP do in Parliament? Why not become abstationists like Sinn Féin? It's there is a point to be made about not recognising Westminster and saying, look, we're just going to abstain. We're not going to take our seats. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. But maybe the SNP say, look, we can use Westminster in a way to promote independence. It's different with Sinn Féin, because what Sinn Féin have a particular baggage that the SNP don't have. So, and I don't think it would be it's different for Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin, one of the reasons Sinn Féin don't take their seats is they have to declare allegiance to the Queen, and they don't agree with having a Queen. They don't view the Queen as their head of state. So it's different for the SNP. The SNP would be refusing to take their seats for a different reason than Sinn Féin. The SNP do not take their seats in the House of Lords. Okay. I never actually noticed that. I never actually copped onto that. Each of the unionists would have to form a Scottish party rather than just a Scottish branch of the UK-wide party. I think the unionist vote would tend to move towards the Tories, yes. Yeah, if you're a unionist, you're likely to be right-wing or conservative. There are unionists, of course, who are left-wing, but they're more likely to... If you're going to vote... But, if you vote for Labour, you want to vote for a party that's in power. And a lot of the policies that the Labour Party would present have already been put in place by the SNP. So, if you're left-wing, you're more likely to vote for a party that is going to win. That would be the SNP. There's, what is Labour presenting that the SNP don't already have? The Tories have a separate party in Scotland, which used to be the Scottish Unionist Party. The Westminster Parliament is the parliament that replaced both the English and Scottish parliaments. The Scottish Grand Committee in Westminster needs Scottish MPs. And also the SNP MPs, they do the job of running committees and asking questions in committees. I'm not completely against... I think Sinn Féin, this is a separate issue, and I understand why Sinn Féin don't take their seats, and I don't have a problem with them doing that. But I think it could be good to have Sinn Féin in the House of Commons. Can you imagine Sinn Féin asking questions of Boris Johnson about the protocol, about, and we've seen how Sinn Féin have dealt with people like Lord Frost. They don't pull any punches. So it'd be interesting to have Sinn Féin in the House of Commons asking questions. It'd be interesting to have Sinn Féin sitting in select committees, asking questions, even chairing them. That would be really interesting. Of course, they're a very small party. They have very few MPs. But, why is the DUP stealing all the limelight? I call the Tories the Ackland, the Scotland and Scottish Conservative and Unionist Muppets. In Scotland, the Scottish, sorry. I support the union because of the economic reasons. I support heavy reforming it, but I might be naive to think that that's possible. Don't know what to make of the potential cultural differences. Look, I'm an outsider, okay, so, Scotland becoming independent would have very little impact on my life, but I think if you're a Scottish person, you're looking at, okay, who's representing me in Parliament, in the Westminster Parliament? It's likely to be somebody from the SNP. Even if you may have voted Tory, but the SNP won the seat. So you would like, if you don't have to support the SNP, but you would hope that your Member of Parliament is doing their best to represent you, to try and fight on your behalf. But if they're being treated like crap, if they're being ignored or laughed at when they raise an issue, even if it's not about Scottish independence, just a cost of living crisis or something like that, and they're being belittled, what sort of message does that send to you? And I've said it before, when an MP is insulted, you're indirectly insulting their constituents. And though their constituents may actually be people who voted for your party. And I think it sends a very bad message. And the people of Scotland, what are they gaining at the moment? Well, you have a Conservative government who delivered a Brexit that the people of Scotland voted against. They're implementing the hardest Brexit possible. Scotland is not being... Scotland tried, the Scottish Government tried to be... to have some sort of influence over the negotiations to what's happening following Brexit. They're being ignored. There was a case where one of the Secretaries of State sent out a message to the Scottish government representative on the same day as the committee meeting was taking place, or the meeting was taking place. Obviously, they couldn't attend. It was too late. But that's because they don't give a crap about Scotland. Because the SNP are in charge. But I think even if the Tories were in charge of Scotland, do you think Westminster would give a crap? I don't think so. Just imagine a scenario, okay? The Tories are leading in Scotland. Tories are running the Scottish Parliament. Do you think they would ask for more powers? Probably not. Would they get more powers? Certainly not. Because the Tories in Westminster don't want to give them more powers. So, even if you had the Tories in charge in Scotland, which is probably blowing the minds of many people on the stream, they would not. Scotland would not be any better off, because it's within the it's within the mindset of the Tories in Westminster that devolved parliaments have fewer and fewer powers. They would like to mothball the Parliament completely close it down, if they could get away with it. That's what, if the Tories were in charge, there would be no Parliament in Scotland, okay? Everything would be run from Westminster. Now, even if you're a unionist in Scotland, I think it'd be very difficult for somebody to agree with that. How does Italy's political system compare to Great Britain? I'm not, I live here, but I'm not a very good, I'm not the best person to ask, because I never really, I haven't educated myself a lot on it. Thanks, AN98. But we tend to have a lot of members of Parliament. I think there are 600 and something. There's where the president is a figurehead. He's not like the French or American presidents. And the Senate, we have a Senate, which is the unelected upper chamber, and the Camera, which is the lower chamber. So it is somewhat like the House of Commons, but instead there is proportional representation. So it is a better voting model than what is in the House in Britain, which is first past the post. You tend to have more coalitions. You tend to have smaller parties having a bigger say in punching above their weight, in a sense. And this has, Italy has had some problems in the past where you've had governments lasting months or at most a couple of years, and that has not, it hasn't been very well viewed by citizens. People see it as the government is dysfunctional. We need to have a new system, but in a sense, you end up with a better type of democracy, but you tend to have a weaker form of government. But I must speak. I keep saying I need to speak with some people about this. I'd like to speak to an Italian politician about this who can explain it maybe much better, a lot better than I could ever. They changed the power of the Welsh Parliament. Yes, and that's part of what they're doing at the moment. It's about taking powers away from the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. It's about concentrating power in Westminster. When it came to the Internal Market Bill, what they're trying to do is set up their own committees who will decide where money goes. So they will say, yes, there's this amount of money allocated to Scotland, this amount of money allocated to Wales, but it won't be the Welsh Assembly or the Scottish Parliament that will decide how the money is spent. It will be a bunch of Tories who will decide. Those Tories being in Scotland and in Wales. And we've seen how since Brexit, the amount of money coming to help deprived areas has completely dropped off a cliff. So guys, I want to move on to just a story on Brexit, of course. Oh, Brexit. Tory rebels seek meaningful vote over Northern Ireland Protocol bill powers. Sir Bob Neill attempts to force Boris Johnson to require parliamentary approval before bringing provisions into force. So a leading Conservative rebel has launched, and this is what's... Now, before we start here, I was really upset yesterday how I saw people like Theresa May stand up in the House of Commons and say, we're going to break international law. This is running roughshod over the Good Friday Agreement and agreements that we have signed with the European Union. And then she abstained. Why didn't she vote against it? Some cynical people would say she wants to protect a future seat in the House of Lords, maybe. Anyway, a leading Conservative rebel has launched an attempt to force Boris Johnson to seek permission from Parliament before using powers in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Sir Bob Neill, the chair of the Justice Committee, tabled an amendment on Tuesday that would require parliamentary approval before bringing into force any provisions of the legislation, which would unilaterally rip up Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland at the risk of a trade war with the EU. This is interesting. Neill's proposal would effectively introduce a meaningful vote for MPs before Johnson would use powers in the bill, which could cause controversy because of allegations it would break international law. Nicky DaCosta, former number 10 advisor on legislative affairs, suggested it would mean that the meaningful vote is back, a reference to Theresa May's need for Parliament to vote in favour of her Brexit deal before it could be approved. I love meaningful votes. It's democracy in action, no? Dozens of Tories, including May, abstained from voting on Johnson's legislation at its second reading, but it is unclear how many would back Neill's attempt to secure parliamentary approval at the next stage of the legislation in the House of Commons. Neill's amendment would also not be enough to satisfy Labour, whose Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy said the bill was illegal and would shred the UK's international reputation as a lawkeeper. One of the problems with having a meaningful vote is that Boris Johnson still has an 80-seat majority. Not 80-seat, but 70-something. The legislation now moves to a more detailed debate in its committee stage in the House of Commons, which is an opportunity for MPs to amend the proposed bill before the summer recess. It will then move to the House of Lords, where it will be considered, where there is considerable concern about the bill. A vote in the House of Lords is not expected until October, but leading peers warned that even if Neill's amendment was passed, it's unlikely to be enough to satisfy critics concerned that the legislation would break international law. Peter Hain, a Labour peer and former Northern Ireland Secretary, said it would not come anywhere near meeting the needs that would likely be demanded by Lords on a crossbench basis. I don't think it approaches the issue. There's the whole question of international law and it being broken, which has crossbenchers, former High Court judges and others up in arms. The whole legislation is dog whistling to the Tories' base rather than a serious approach to negotiation. However, a Labour stance in the House of Lords cautioned that it is not certain that there is enough Labour, Liberal Democrat and crossbench and Tory rebel peers to block the legislation, as Johnson has appointed more allies to the upper chamber in recent years. This whole idea that you can have a sitting MP just, dump loads of new peers in the House of Lords. Johnson has a problem. Send some more people to the House of Lords. That sorts it out. That's democratic, isn't it? Wonderful. The second reading of the bill on Monday was the first opportunity for MPs to vote on the proposal, which Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said was legal and necessary. Johnson predicted earlier on Monday that the laws would go through fairly rapidly, and be on the statute books by the end of the year. But if the Lords make changes or attempts to block the bill entirely, it could be another year before the legislation makes it through and makes it onto the statute book. This is because the government would have to deploy the Parliament Act, which forces through a bill without permission from the Lords after a year. Yes, so it's likely that we're not going to see the end of this Northern Ireland Protocol bill for at least a year. And then after a year, if it hasn't gone through the Lords, then probably they'll deploy the Parliament Act and just force it through. Which doesn't sound very democratic, does it? But then Boris Johnson and the Tories are not into democracy. Now, a number of things could happen between now and then. Boris Johnson, for example, could be removed from power. And then I think this Northern Ireland Protocol bill would be mothballed. It would cease to exist, maybe even. So it would be dropped. And all of this would come to nothing. This would be the best outcome. But then Boris Johnson isn't planning on going anywhere. There isn't a real replacement for him yet. And the Brexiteers need to be kept angry and happy at the same time. Scott, thank you so much for that super chat. Nothing democratic in the UK. I know that they don't get the votes they need in England and Wales. I forgot about PC. I'm British, but I'd like a united Ireland with a devolved Northern Ireland. Not that many outside Glasgow are bothered about Northern Ireland goals too. That's an interesting idea, and it has been floated a number of times, of having Northern Ireland, so in a united Ireland. Not talking about united Ireland really tonight, but I just wanted to respond to that because I've heard it before, the idea of having a devolved government in Northern Ireland, and I think this would be a bad idea, because what purpose would it serve? It would be just an attempt to keep the DUP and certain unionists happy, but they would no longer be unionists. Just think about it for a moment. When a united Ireland takes place, you're no longer a unionist. And I don't mean this in some as a pejorative. I don't mean unions would become a pejorative, or that unionism would cease to exist. But in a sense it would, because union to what? The union is over. It's like saying, I'm an imperialist for the British Empire. Well, the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. So you'd be identifying as something that no longer exists. The union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland would no longer exist. Now, you could be pro-British, yes, that's okay, and identify as British, but you wouldn't be a unionist. I know it'd be very difficult for people to accept that, but there would be no more union. Now, you can try and campaign for the Republic of Ireland, which would be a united Ireland, to rejoin the union. Good luck with that. But yes, it's not going to happen. There would have to be some sort of benefit. What would be the benefit? And the benefit would have to be greater than EU membership. And we're seeing at the moment, of course, that there is growing feeling that maybe the UK should rejoin the EU. Going it alone isn't working out very well. No need. Northern Ireland is literally part of Ireland. Yes, it would be a talking shop, and it'd be completely pointless. It would just be an attempt to keep the DUP happy in some way, but the DUP are never happy. And the DUP would cease to exist, because what would be the point of the DUP? What would be the point of the TUV, or the Ulster Unionists? Like, they would eventually merge with the existing parties. So the DUP would probably join Fine Gael, for example. The MPs from the DUP, or the politicians from the DUP. Because these people care about power. Okay? They don't care so much about the union. Brexit has demonstrated that. Jeffrey Donaldson doesn't care about the union. He knows people who vote for him do, but he doesn't. Otherwise, he wouldn't have campaigned for Brexit. He'd be trying to stop Brexit. as it's damaging the union. I don't believe these people actually care about the union. They care about power. They understand that many people care about the union, and in order to have power, you need to convince them that you're on their side. So if there was a United Ireland tomorrow, Jeffrey Donaldson would be sitting in Dáil Éireann as probably a TD for his constituency. Now, the constituencies could be new. And he wouldn't be talking about the union. He'd be talking about whatever his constituents were concerned about, farming or industry or whatever. It's a strange idea, but that's what they'd be doing, because they would be, now I'm getting paid in euros. I'm sitting in Dáil Éireann and getting paid a lot of money. I can claim lots of expenses, and I represent my constituent because I want them to vote for me next time. I don't want them to vote for the other guy. And because if they vote for the other guy, I'm out my ear and I don't get any money. And I have no power. These people are not unionists. They don't care about the union. They care about power and money as well. That's enough about Brexit. We're going to return to Brexit, of course, in the future as well. Not directly related to Brexit, but TUC workers' rights warned over post-Brexit trade deals. Now, of course, there are a lot of protests taking place at the moment, strike action all over the UK. It says here, ministers have been accused of pushing for post-Brexit trade deals with more than a dozen countries around the world which do not guarantee workers' rights or systematically violate employee protections. The Trade Union Congress said ministers were in active talks with 13 nations with a worrying track record on employment rights, including Brazil, Burundi, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in order to secure trade deals after leaving the EU. Reagan Ali, thanks so much for that super chat. Change is necessary. I believe all four nations would benefit from the breakup of the union in the long term. Yeah, the English people would have their parliament. A parliament that focuses on English issues and not UK issues. And I hope that Parliament would be based on a proportional representation voting model. It probably would. And you're right. Sometimes, who was it that said, if you love something, let it go free? If you love the Scottish people, let them go free. If you love the Welsh people, let them go free. If you love the English people, let them go free. Occam's Brute. I love the name. Thanks so much for that super chat. Thanks, Reagan Elite, as well. How about dual sovereignty in Northern Ireland? Allow Northern Ireland citizens to voluntarily pay tax to Republic of Ireland or HMRC, with Stormont having full control of budget for the region. This is something that was... you'll be paying tax to something that you don't have any control over. Now, I haven't looked into this because this is the first time I've actually heard this suggestion. But I'm just thinking, it would be like me paying tax. So I pay tax in Italy, okay, because I'm resident here. But it'd be me paying tax in Ireland. Like, okay, but I don't benefit from any of the services that I'm paying taxes to. So people in Northern Ireland would have... Are you talking about in a United Ireland, or are you talking about now? Dual sovereignty in Northern Ireland, so allow Northern Ireland citizens to voluntarily pay. So people who could decide, I'm going to pay taxes to the government, but Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom at the moment. I think it'd be very complex. So people would say, but how do you determine who has paid tax and where they've paid tax? And who would be the determiner of who paid tax? That's my question. Would be, who would it, if I say, okay, I live in Belfast and I'm going to pay my taxes to the Republic of Ireland Department of Finance, or no, Department of the Inland Revenue, the Revenue Commissioner, sorry. So the Revenue Department. I want to pay my taxes to them. Who's going to check if I paid them? Would it be an executive in Northern Ireland? They would decide. I would have to show some sort of proof. But then if I'm paying tax there, and not getting any sort of benefit, then there'd be no point of doing that. I'm not criticizing your idea. Maybe it has some merits, but it just sounds like you'd be paying money to somebody and not getting anything in return. It would be like, as I said, if I'm living here in Italy and I'm paying tax to the Irish government and not getting anything in return, like services, I'd be like, why am I doing that? I prefer to pay tax to the government where I am and be able to take advantage of the services of that administration. Thanks for that super chat from both of you. It comes as tensions mount between unions and government amid strike action over pay and conditions, with Boris Johnson's administration accused of deploying culture war tactics to drive a wedge between unionized staff and the rest of society. Yes, you've heard all the arguments about how train drivers earn a lot of money, but it's not train drivers that were on strike. It was ordinary rail staff, people who like clean toilets or sell tickets. Ministers have promised law changes to reduce strike disruption by allowing employers to hire agency workers to cover staff. This is real Brexit stuff. And we talked about this before, and we highlighted it before, and we mentioned how Brexiteers, and I'm talking about the ones who sold Brexit, the ones who are making the money here, not your average person on the street who doesn't want foreigners around. Talking about the people who are bankrolling Brexit. What they want is to remove protections for workers so that people can be fired and rehired, or people can be laid off and replaced with agency staff. Why replace with agency staff? Because you can pay them less, and if they're usually people from abroad, maybe they don't speak English very well, they don't know their rights, and they're not going to complain. You don't want British people working for you because they know their rights and they can complain. Better hire some people who speak broken English on minimum wage or below minimum wage, because they're not going to complain. And if they do, you fire them and you replace them the next day with somebody else from the same country. This is post-Brexit Britain. This is exactly what Brexiteers wanted. The Brexiteers at the top, the ones making the money. Union leaders said the government was showing total disregard for workers around the world. According to a report from the International Trade Union Confederation, the union's global umbrella group, sackings at P&O ferries where 800 workers were fired and with no notice and no consultation, was one of the clearest examples of labour abuses around the world. The TUC said the government that readily agrees deals with countries that abuse rights abroad is one that won't stick up for rights at home either. Yes. If Boris Johnson's government is happy to do trade deals with countries that abuse workers, then of course they're going to allow their workers at home to be abused. It called on ministers to stop attacking fundamental trade union rights and to make good on its promise to improve workplace protections. See, the Brexiteers also sold the idea that once we leave the EU, we can have better worker protections. The complete and utter opposite. And unfortunately, the public are still distracted by rubber boats in the channel and culture wars. Gender-neutral toilet rolls. Gender-neutral sausage rolls. That was the one James O'Brien came up with. Statues. This ridiculous culture war. That's what the public are being distracted by this when their rights are being taken away. Their right to protest is being taken away. Their rights as citizens are taken away. Their rights as workers are being eroded on a daily basis. And if you don't like it, well, don't worry. We'll replace you with somebody who's not going to complain. The government has promised 18 months ago that the union representatives would have a place on the powerful post-Brexit trade advisory groups, panels set up to be consulted on the text of trade negotiations, but so far failed to confirm any appointments. Currently, only businesses have seats on these groups. There we have it. So this here post-Brexit trade advisory groups. So the Tories said, okay, what we'll do is we'll set up these trade advisory groups. We'll tell the trade union, we'll give you some seats at the table. And they haven't given them any seats. And these seats have been filled by business leaders. And what do the business leaders, what is the objective of these business leaders? Is, of course, to make a profit. Reduce cost, maximize profit. And what's a good way to maximize profit? Well, to lay off a lot of expensive workers and replace them with cheap ones. The TUC said the continued failure to properly consult, and what really upsets me as well, the RMT union, which is headed by Mick Lynch, campaigned for Brexit. They told their members, vote for Brexit. It'll be good for workers. It'll be good for trade unions. And some of them still think it's a good idea. Now, look, I think Mick Lynch is doing good work, protesting, but he still supports Brexit. I bang my head against the wall when I hear these things. How can you support something that's clearly against your own interests? He doesn't seem the type of person who's so hard-headed that he will refuse to accept reality. He wants the government to bend. He wants the government to accept reality, but he doesn't seem to want to do that. I'm sorry to be picking on him, but he has to take responsibility for this. His union told workers, go out there and vote for Brexit. It'll be great. We'll be able to have a sunlit upland. It'd be wonderful for workers' rights. And what's happening now? Post-trade advisory groups are being set up by the government and unions are being closed out. Workers on ferries are being laid off and replaced by agency staff in Britain, but not in France. One of the 67 non-EU countries the government has negotiated trade deals with, as many as 5 are listed on the 10 worst countries in the world for workers, according to an index published by the ITUC, including Turkey, Colombia and Egypt. As many as 10 are placed in the 44 countries with no guarantee of workers' rights, including Ecuador and Jordan, while 8 are amongst the 38 nations where there is systematic violation of workers' rights, including Australia and Vietnam. All the best countries. Last week, the government kicked off talks in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to agree deals with countries worth £33.1 billion of trade across the Gulf Cooperation Council, made up of nations including Bahrain, Kuwait and Qatar. Somebody's going to make a lot of money. It won't be workers. It won't be ordinary people. But that's what Brexit was all about. That's what we have been trying to tell people since 2016. Brexit is not for ordinary people. Brexit is rich people telling poor people that you need to vote for this because of foreigners or because of 3-pin plugs or because of bendy bananas. And don't worry, you'll be rich. Yeah, you'll be much richer if you vote for Brexit. And the reality is the opposite, of course. Somebody's making a lot of money. It won't be workers. And it pisses me off that there are still left-wing Brexiteers in existence. People on the left who still think Brexit is a good idea. They think it's, we just need to wait. If we get the Tories out, then we'll be able to get in a left-wing government and we're going to roll back all of these things. Well, if Labour, and I prefer Labour in power, but Labour are not going to roll back a lot of these changes. Labour are moving more to the centre. I even heard, I think it was West Streeting, who was talking about, there needs to be in the NHS a public-private partnership. He's not against privatisation. He's against complete privatisation, but not against some type of privatisation. There you have it. So your option is between a party that wants complete privatisation of the NHS, who wants to throw all workers under a bus, and the other side is, the other option is a party that wants some privatisation and is going to try not to throw all workers under a bus. Try. Some will have to go. You can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs, but... And there are still left-wing Brexiteers. People on the left who think, yeah, we'll just any moment now, we'll get our people in and it'll be wonderful for workers. They're still living in this fantasy world. There's a thin line between the insane Brexiteers who are talking about, who read the Express, and the other Lexiteers, the left-wing Brexiteers who think, any moment now, our guy is going to come in, he's going to undo Boris Johnson's Brexit, he's going to undo all these trade deals, he's going to make it wonderful for us, it'll be a workers' revolution. People have been talking about that since the 1960s. And, the Tories have been in power more than the Labour Party. I'm sorry to be so downbeat, but people need a strong dose of reality. A Department for International Trade spokesperson said, we maintain a high level of protection on our labour standards, bullshit, and we will not compromise them in any of our trade agreements. They said, we will not compromise on hormone-treated beef, and will not compromise on a number of issues when it comes to importing, for example, meat or whatever from Australia. And then in the trade deal, they compromised on everything. Max, some parts of the NHS is already private. Doctors and dentists are private under NHS settlement. Thanks, Magic. I was speaking to Phil from A Different Bias. I don't know if we were talking about it on the stream or we mentioned it before the stream. But, he was saying the NHS has already been sold off. There's very little now of it being under public control. And he's probably right. It's not so much protecting the NHS, it's trying to bring it back, trying to resuscitate it, because it has been pretty much all privatized. But it really upsets me that there are people who still think, we need to... our Brexit will come along one day. Labour will not sack frontbenchers who joined rail strike pickets. And this is something now that I had imagined was going to happen. So some weeks ago, when the strikes began, Keir Starmer had instructed his frontbenchers not to join the pickets. If they did, they would face some sort of action. Some disciplinary action. But that seems not to be the case anymore. Keir Starmer has backed away from sacking Labour frontbenchers who defied his instructions and stood alongside striking workers last week. Labour's chief whip, Alan Campbell, spoke to the 5 frontbenchers, the shadow ministers Alex Sobel, the whip Nav Mishra, and 3 principal private secretaries who posted photos of themselves on the picket lines. It is understood 5 of them were sent letters about their future conduct, but that all of them were allowed to remain in their posts. Mishra retweeted last Thursday that the strikes got underway. As a proud trade unionist, I stand with all the workers on their rail network who are taking industrial action to fight for their jobs and keep passengers safe. Starmer issued a memo last week before the RMT union, 3 days of strike action, informing his front bench team that they should show leadership and that frontbenchers, including PPSs, should not be on the picket lines. Other frontbenchers stopped short of attending the picket lines, but made clear that they are backing the RMT's decision to take industrial action. Starmer's deputy Angela Rayner tweeted, "Workers have been left with no choice." A number of backbenchers, many of them from the Socialist Campaign Group of left-wing MPs, also attended picket lines to show their support for the striking workers. So it's good that, I think this was something that was going to happen anyway, that Starmer would pull back, because it wasn't going to be very good for him to be seen punishing members of his own party for standing on the side of workers. So that's important that happened.
We're expecting...
So we've heard about rail workers, we've heard about airline staff, we've heard about a number of different barristers as well taking industrial action, and now it seems also Royal Mail workers could be the next to strike.
It's in a very big yes vote. I think we'll easily break the thresholds. The government, and I would expect to get 90% excess of that voting in favour. As we always say, the objective is not to have a strike, it's to reach a settlement. But the background to this is that the company have made record profits for the second year running, £758 million. They've paid £400 million to shareholders.
And there we have it. So you have companies who are making... If these companies will say, we can't afford these pay increases, we'll go under. But they've made massive profits, and they've made profits that are so great that they can provide a pretty good dividend to their shareholders. This money should be reinvested in workers, reinvested in the company, but instead it's been handed over to shareholders. If it was nationalised, this would not be happening. The workers would get the pay rise that they desire, or at least there would be a negotiation with the government to have a better pay increase.
And at the same time as the CEO and the board have decided to impose a 2% pay increase on workers, they're getting bonuses in the region of £140,000. So by any level of fairness, this is completely unacceptable, and they're treating the workforce with utter contempt.
What is it that you want?
We want a good settlement. We want a settlement that protects our members against the current cost of living crisis, that rewards their efforts during the pandemic. These were key workers, done a fantastic job to keep this company going. And, you know what...
So one of the responses to all of this is it's going to cause inflation. It's going to cause wage spiral inflation. But what is the alternative to, if that's the case, and there, you know, expert opinion is that's not the case. It's not going to drive inflation, because you're not giving people extra money that they're going to just go out and buy Ferraris with. You're giving people money to help them get by. So it's not that... In the case of when what's going to... If you give people massive bonuses, what are they going to do? They're going and spend it all over the place. But that's not what's going to happen with these pay increases. People are going to maybe pay off some of their debts that they have incurred during the pandemic, or trying to get by with the cost of living. They're going to maybe pay off some of the bills that they've been accumulating, that they've been trying to avoid. This is not... You're going to give people money today, and they're not going to go out and spend it all over the place, which could, in a sense, increase inflation. They're going to spend it on basic things. I think this cost of living crisis has dampened a lot of people's interest in, for example, going to the restaurant or going to the cinema or going out for a few drinks in the evening. People have stopped doing that. And even if you give them a pay increase of 10%, they're not going to suddenly go, oh, look, I got a pay increase of 10%. Now I'm going to start going out, you know, drinking and having a dinner in a restaurant and stuff like that. They're not, because they're saying like, okay, you know, there's a cost of living crisis at the moment, and inflation is running high, and bills are going to increase in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be very careful with my money. Not that people are not careful before, but even with an increase, they're not going to go out and spend it all over the place. They're going to maybe put some aside for when the next jump in fuel prices comes, and it's expected in October. And October is a cold period where people will have to stay in the dark. They'll need more. They need to use their lights more, need their heating more. Cooking hot meals. It's going to be more expensive. So even with an increase in their, even an increase of 10%, people are still going to struggle. Gareth, thanks so much for that super chat. Just tell Beer here, Corma's here. Sorry, I'm getting the giggle snap. Broken. I'll try and read it. Thanks, Karen. Just tell beer Karma's here. Karma Chameleon. Karma's here. I love karma. Indian food. Karma's here. It was a work event. Also thrilled to hear about the Scottish independence referendum, Sir Alba. Thanks for that super chat. Oh my goodness, okay.
What they've put on the table at the moment is unacceptable. In terms of the level of that, I mean, I hear these debates about, you know, unions are asking for figures that are going to spiral inflation. You know, it's not true. You know, workers aren't going to get 12, 13, 14% pay rises. But there's a huge gap between what's on offer here and what these companies can afford. And we're going to get the very best deal we can for our members.
What do you want?
Of course they're going to try and get the best they can.
Well, I've just told you what we want. I'm not here negotiating.
Well, you know, we no. Let me say the doctors want told 30% over 5 years. We know that barristers want 25%. We have other percentage figures as well. Why is it not reasonable to ask you?
Well, because what I'm saying is, you know, that's a matter for negotiation, and our members.
Of course, he's not going to tell Sky News. It's like, you know, if he says, "Oh, we're going to go for 10%," and then the companies go, okay, so you told Sky News 10%, okay, then we're going to give you 3%, and we're going to negotiate you down from 10%. Of course, he's not, you know, it'd be ridiculous. You know, he could say 20%, and then she would say, what are you talking about? So, you know, the position that they would accept, of course, is higher than what they're going to say.
This will back the union. We want to match inflation if we can achieve that. But, you know, I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, the company keeps saying that they've offered 5.5%. Well, that's not true. They've imposed 2%. 5.5% is never going to be acceptable. These are matters for negotiation. The company has got to come to the table with a substantially improved offer, and they can afford it.
Would 11% be enough? I mean, because that's what we're expecting inflation to be at.
Well,
so it would just be, if I could finish my question.
Anthony McGill's very good point. Tories own shares. The Tories own shares in these companies, so you know they want to see them make a profit. Well, but it's going to come at the expense of the workers. Who gives a crap about the workers?
May finish my question. Let me just finish my question.
Well, it would certainly be something that we'd go back and talk to our members about, wouldn't it?
Okay, but that would just be standing still.
Well, look, we understand the realities of the situation. But employers need to understand that, you know, you can't carry on with this agenda of levelling down the workforce. And it's happening not just in Royal Mail, it's happening in other industries where we represent members right across the UK. And it is.
Gareth, thanks so much for that super chat. How can it be detrimental to inflation? The money they give to shareholders could quite easily be redirected and redistributed those funds to the workers, right? There's no need to print money. Yes. Like, if these companies, you know, in a sense, you could have a windfall tax. Oh, you've made a massive profit. Okay, we're going to take some of that profit and we're going to give it to the workers. You know, or you could instruct the companies, if you invest, you could give them incentives, like you'll pay less tax if you redistribute your profits to the workers or something like that. I'm just, you know, spitballing here, but you know, there are ways that you could instruct companies to help their workers. I think the best solution would be to nationalize these industries. If they're not able to pay their workers a decent wage, well then how about we nationalize you? that on its own is enough of a threat to convince these companies. Yeah. How much were you looking for? 10%? Sure. How about we give you 11? You know, the threat of nationalization is enough to convince many private companies to do whatever the government wants them to do. But then at the moment you have a Tory government who's profiting, as I think it was Andrew said, probably profiting from all of this, which is really sad. You have members of parliament who are earning at least £82,000 a year, at least, because many of them, you know, are ministers or have some job on the side, like, you know, writing articles for the Express or the Daily Mail. And they have shares in these companies. And there, you know, is a conflict of interest, obviously, because they don't want the money to be redirected from, you know, away from them to the workers. They want the money to redirect it away from the workers to them.
There's a levelling down agenda. And I think it's so unfair at the moment that every time workers decide to do something about the situation and they come together in their collective strength, that somehow we're in the wrong. And we're not. And I don't think people are going to put up with the unfairness that's going on, with the imbalance of power and wealth that permeates the world of work, the economy, and all of the growing inequalities in society. I think the tide is turning.
How do you feel about coordinated strike action?
Well, look, I think you do whatever is necessary to increase the pressure on the employer and to achieve the best deal. But at the end of it, our focus will be on our dispute. What is happening is coordination. There's a campaign that's running alongside this. It's going to continue beyond these particular pay disputes that are taking place across the UK at the moment. And that's called a campaign for a new deal for workers and a new social settlement in the UK.
What's that
It's
mean?
being led by trade unions.
What does it mean?
It means shifting the balance of forces in the world of work. So it means starting to get proper jobs, not relying on these insecure employment models that are dragging the whole nation down.
It's great to hear. And I really hope this is what's going to happen, because there needs to be a move away from things like 0-hour contracts and these type of work conditions where, look, and I've said this before, the new generation, the younger generation, are starting 3-0 down, and they're expected to perform like everyone, the other generations who have had, some generations have had everything handed to them. You have a young generation starting now trying to get on the property ladder, which is extremely difficult, if not impossible. You need to be earning, you can afford to pay rent, but you can't afford a mortgage. That's what the banks are telling you. Yeah, your rent may be £1,500 a month. You can afford that, but we won't give you a mortgage of £1,000. So this blocks many people from getting from a position where they're renting to buying, which would make a huge difference, because if the money you're handing over to someone else, it's actually going into the bank and it's providing you with a means to, an asset that you can use in the future. You can sell it, or you can do something else with it. You can mortgage against it or whatever. This is something that the government should be helping young people, but it's difficult to get to that state where if you're on a 0-hour contract, or if you're on universal credit, for example, you're working and you're on universal credit, or you're on universal credit alone, or even if you're working and you're not on universal credit, it's very difficult unless you have a type of contract, a gold-plated contract of employment. It's very difficult to get on the property ladder. If you can't get on the property ladder, it's very difficult to accumulate some sort of asset, as I said, that you could pass on to your children or you could sell in the future. It's a very difficult moment for young people. Employment laws are working against them. We've seen it earlier on in the stream, how the UK government is planning to sign more and more trade deals with countries that have fewer rights for their workers than there are existing in the UK at the moment. And what would that mean? It will mean that in the future, businesses in Britain will be able to access these workers and bring them in through agencies. It's not about helping British workers, it's the opposite. And I think we're at a very key moment now in this whole post-Brexit era where the workers really need to stand up. This is their last chance. If they don't get the Tory government to back down, it's pretty much over.
It means levelling up.
Sorry, Magic, thanks so much for that super chat. High skill, high wage economy means paying more. It's the typical sort of, ridiculous 1984-esque speech from the likes of the Conservatives. Up is down, war is peace, off to the Ministry of Love. this idea that, yes, we want to have a high-skilled, high-wage economy, but what we're doing is we're providing less support for young people to gain skills, and we're it's a race to the bottom when it comes to employment. Fire and rehire is the perfect example of that. Gareth, thanks so much for that super chat. I mean, personally, I blame the strikes on Labour, Jeremy Corbyn, the Northern Ireland Protocol, JC, Sinn Féin, JC, Remainers, JC, Do-Gooders, JC, Lefties, JC. Is JC Jeremy Corbyn or Jesus Christ? But yes. Sinn Féin got a mention. That's good. Thanks so much for that. UBI. Magic says UBI. Yes, UBI could. Although, I think there was. I hope the opportunity for UBI has not gone completely. It's been introduced in Wales, it seems, and there is a pilot scheme in Scotland. But there really needs to be a push. But I think we need to get rid of the Tories first. Rishi Sunak is completely against the idea of a UBI, and Boris Johnson, he wouldn't even know he wouldn't be able to spell it. No, what's her name? Nadine Dorries wouldn't be able to spell it. But a UBI of universal basic income, providing people at least £1,000 a month for the rest of their lives, unconditional. So it's universal for everyone. It will go a long way to help a lot of people, but at the moment there isn't really an appetite for it, unfortunately. UBI starting next month in Wales. That's great. Thanks so much for that comment, Reagan Elite. So I'm going to keep an eye on that, and I'm sure you will keep me informed too. Great, because of course it's just as far as I know, it's just a pilot. It's not running all over Wales, but it's a first step, and I'm pretty sure it will work, but it needs to be supported. And let's hope the result, the media coverage is positive as well. Max has been triggered, UBI. Yes. Labour won't be any better. John Cleese. JC was John Cleese.
Lost over.
Some of the groups that are protesting, of course, do not get as much coverage as others. And many people seem to think that, oh, well, barristers, well, they earn a lot of money. Why would they be protesting? Well, it's not the case. It says here, powerful words from Jonathan Rees, QC, at Cardiff Barristers Picket. He says colleagues have been driven out of jobs they love because they could not afford to stay, and describes junior criminal barristers' median income of just £12,200 a year as scandalous. Let's hear what he had to say.
We have lost over a quarter of our prosecutors and our defenders over the last 5 years, driven out of the jobs they loved because they simply could not afford to stay. For junior criminal barristers to be paid a below minimum wage median income of just £12,200 a year is not only scandalous, but it will choke off the supply of the next generation of advocates. And it means that victims and defendants will suffer years and years of waiting to get justice in court.
Now, it's important to differentiate between public barristers and private barristers. So he's talking here about public barristers. So these are people who represent people who are, who can't afford a private barrister, private barristers are extremely expensive. Most, people will have to rely on a public barrister. Public barristers on £12,200 a year. They have a massive workload. As the junior ones are deciding, look, I can't afford to live on this. I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit this profession, something that I have studied years upon years and to qualify in, and now I'm quitting it because I can't afford to live on this type of salary. And this is the government deciding it. The government has not increased it over the last 5 years, I think. They have been and this is what is it going to do? It's going to mean people who need access to justice will have to pay for it, or wait. And a barrister was talking recently about how there are people who are sitting in prison on remand, waiting for a trial, but the trial has been delayed because they don't have enough staff. They don't have the barristers available. And it's costing £50,000 a year to keep someone in prison. And many of these people will be acquitted. So the government is happy to hand over money, millions upon millions of pounds to the private prison system, but they won't hand it over to public barristers. And this is a right. This should be a right for all people. People should have the access to the legal protections that are part of their rights. They should have access to these legal protections, and they're being denied them because the government don't want to spend the money. Thanks so much for that super chat. I personally blame the strikes on Meghan Markle. Of course, she's behind all of it. You know, destroying the royal family from within, convincing Harry to give up on his family. She's been poisoning so many minds, and she, of course she's behind the strikes. You probably got that that from a reputable source like, I don't know, GB News or something. Thanks for that super chat. Gareth, thank you so much as well. Once again. Oh, and by the way, I mentioned my mum's benefits being slashed a few streams back. She got a letter at the end of last week from the Department of Work and Pensions. She's expected to pay back £11,500 worth of overpay. For fuck's sake. So the Department of Work and Pensions fucked up, and she has to pay it back. Imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if the Department of Work and Pensions didn't pay her enough, and then she wrote a letter to the Department of Work and Pensions saying, you owe me £11,500. What do you think they would do? They would say, fuck off. Or they would say, yeah, we'll look into it. Or we'll see you in court. And they would spend huge amounts of money trying to avoid to pay this £11,500. They would probably lose. You or your mother would have to pay the expenses then. Would have to pay for an expensive barrister. And if it was a public barrister, you'd be waiting years for this public barrister to represent you. And they're coming after her for £11,500 worth of overpay. But when people were claiming, companies and individuals were claiming on the furlough, what did Rishi Sunak do? He just wrote it off. I'm not going to give you legal advice, but I imagine this could be wrote off as well. And I think if the Department of Work and Pension wanted to get this money, it could be difficult for them to do it. And maybe a lawyer would say that they may be forced to write it off as well. But I'm not an expert, and don't take me as one. But they can go, you know what. So guys, I want to say we're at the end of the stream for tonight. I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who came on. Thanks for all of the super chats, greatly appreciated as always. Thank you so much for those. And I want to say thanks to the moderators for doing a wonderful job. I think we had a few trolls on tonight, but they were dealt with quite swiftly. We have our chat on the Discord server after the stream. Hope to see you, if you're on Patreon, I hope to see you on then. Otherwise, I'll see you on Friday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Take care, guys. But before we go, we always have our one for the road. It's an old one, but I'm sure you'll still like it. Enjoy.
It's true we've had some bad results in these by-elections. In fact, I haven't been so disappointed by a result since Carrie's last pregnancy test. As a government, I have to listen to what people are saying, because I am the government. Would we really have a government without me? Worth having? Look, people are saying that they're worried about the cost of living crisis, that I'm awful, that they want us to cut taxes, and I think it's important that we listen to at least 2/3 of their concerns. I don't want to minimise these results, but it has to be said that governments always lose elections in the mid-term. And in the greater scheme of things, when you look at these results, they're actually rather small. And I say that without minimising them. I think what most voters are thinking is, look, we got through COVID, okay? We got all of the big calls right. I'm extremely handsome and capable. Sorry, did I say that's what voters were thinking? That's actually what I'm thinking. Look, these by-elections are simply the result of a perfect storm. A terrible Prime Minister, terrible policies, terrible cabinet, and terrible candidates. Plus inflation. There have been a lot of distractions, unhelpful stories about parties in Downing Street, etc. And the thing is, if nobody had heard about these parties, nobody would have cared. I'm not blaming the media. I'm just saying that if you only reported the things that we wanted you to, everyone would be happier. I mean, think about it. Did people enjoy hearing about those parties? No. Many people got very angry and upset. So why tell them? Ignorance is bliss. Just ask Nadine, or Dominic, or Suella. Well, you get the idea. What I really need now is a strong chief of staff, like, well, I don't know, my wife. Oh, maybe that's against the ministerial code. Just give me a sec. Not anymore. Yes, this country is going through a difficult patch. We are forecast to have the lowest growth in the G20, apart from Russia. But to be fair, we are both fighting a war in Ukraine. I think it's very kind of Oliver Dowden to resign and take responsibility for these results, because that is the one thing we kept hearing over and over again on the doorstep of Tiverton and Honiton and Wakefield. Get rid of Oliver Dowden, they cried, once we'd explained who he was. Just because I'm here in Rwanda doesn't mean I'm trying to avoid the issue. But on the other hand, we have just paid them £120 million. I wonder if there's some way I could apply for a sort of platinum asylum.
Wonderful. We saw it before, but I had to see it again. It was wonderful. Platinum asylum. And get rid of Oliver Dowden. Freddie B, thanks so much for that super chat just at the end. Just back from Guns N' Roses. Go on, Max. We'll rewatch. Go Max, we'll rewatch. Great. I hope you had a wonderful time. Guns N' Roses, one of my favourite bands. Thunderstruck, one of my favourite songs. So thanks so much for that last super chat. Thanks to everyone who came on to the stream tonight. Thanks for all of the super chats and all of the comments. I see you on Friday. Same bad time, same bad channel. Take care and good night.